I have the review sheets for the midterm. I'm going to hand those out near the end of class. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you all should have, or if you don't have, you should have figured out a way to get the short essay by George Orwell entitled Shooting an Elephant, which is the subject of our discussion next time. So, and the subject of the second response paper due next time as well. I will post the link on the Blackboard site today for you to be able to upload, if I haven't already. I don't think I did it yet for the second paper. But I will post a link for you to upload it just as you did with the first paper on the Bhagavad Gita. So any questions about that? Concerns? Okay. And I'll talk about the exam. I'll leave a couple of minutes here at the end to talk about it. What I want to talk about today, or at least start talking about, is South Asia after 1857, after the failure of the Indian Rebellion and the takeover of control in India from the East India Company by the British government directly. That is, the British government in 1857 and 1858 comes to the conclusion that India is being mismanaged by the East India Company. That's why you had a rebellion, a revolution, or as people at the time will call it, a mutiny by Indian troops. But that India is at this point far too valuable for Britain to lose control of it. That is, India provides several things. It provides a potential source of military might. If the East India Company's own army can be placed under direct British control. It promises to be an enormous market, or to continue to be an enormous market for British industrial manufacturers, things like cotton textiles. It's a place where in the 1840s and 50s there had been a significant amount of British investment, specifically in railways. By 1920, in fact, India is going to have the fourth largest railway system in the entire world, after the United States in terms of length, in terms of miles of track. It's the Americans, the Canadians, and the Russians. The Americans, the Russians, and the Canadians, and then it's India. You have the fact that India offers a significant base for the Royal Navy in its operations around the world. India makes Britain a global power. That's why Britain is so determined to maintain control after 1857, 1858. It's why the British government is willing to send troops. It's why it's willing in 1858 to commit to this sort of takeover of South Asia, or of what the East India Company had controlled in South Asia. What I want to talk about today is the way in which what comes to be known as the British Raj. Raj means kingdom or empire. The era of the Raj tends to mean the period from 1858 to 1947 of direct British control. And by direct British control, I mean this. There will be a cabinet-level position in Britain with direct responsibility for the governance of India, separate from any other colonial possession, sort of like a foreign secretary, a secretary of the treasury. There will be a secretary for India from 1858 until 1947. There will also be, in India itself, a viceroy. That is, a governor for India itself. And India will be split into an amalgamation of directly governed provinces, where a British colonial governor will rule, and princely states. That is, you will have provinces which will have direct colonial control with a British governor. And then you will have the princely states, where you will have, and I mentioned them before, places like Mysore and Hyderabad. Where a prince or Raja or Maharaja or Nizam or Sultan will continue to rule, but there will be a British representative stationed at his court, and the rulers of these princely states, while they will have a lot of autonomy within their own state, will sign treaties, sign agreements agreeing that they are subject ultimately to British sovereignty in South Asia. Doing this does a couple of things. In the first place, it allows the British to, in some senses, subcontract out some of the governing in South Asia. It also allows them to build up some sort of local allies. That is, the princes in India will remain fairly satisfied with the colonial regime as it exists for the next 90 years or so, because it basically leaves them alone. In exchange for an agreement to respect British sovereignty, to pay certain amounts to British government every year, they're basically left alone. Any questions about this? One of the things about the British takeover, the direct British takeover of South Asia in 1858, is that it's going to bring an enormous amount of structure. The East India Company had proceeded, as we've seen, on sort of an ad hoc basis, amalgamating control of places, instituting different sort of revenue collection regimes in different places, using, you might say, sort of traders and others as administrators, at least at the start, experimenting with all sorts of alliances and ultimately sort of arrangements with Indian or South Asian princes. The somewhat haphazard, or at least sort of patchwork approach the East India Company had taken is now going to be replaced by a very top-down administrative structure. That is, you will have, as I said, a viceroy who will supervise the provincial governors. In the provinces and in the center, there will be now something called the ICS, or the Indian Civil Service. A bureaucracy of several thousand who will be recruited almost entirely in Britain. It'll be opened up to South Asians at the end of the 19th century, but they'll be recruited almost entirely in Britain, and will be given charge, both in Britain and in South Asia, of running this massive colony. They're only going to number, at most, about 2,500. The vast majority of Europeans, it'll reach a peak of about sort of 100,000 Europeans after the First World War. But the majority of Europeans in India will be involved in trading, or they'll be in the army. It'll be a very small number of administrators directly charged with running India. But they will be a very sort of self-regarding elite. And the sort of advent of this structure not only means that there is going to be much greater emphasis on building up India physically as a state, you might say, not as a state as we understand it in a federation, but a state as in a place with an organized administration, bureaucracy, sort of coherent and unified governance, instead of the sort of patchwork East India Company. So there's going to be a construction of a physical state, and you might also say there's going to be a lot of work in sort of constructing who is in that state. You might say sort of both the physical and the mental construction of what, quote-unquote, India is. They will refer, the British will refer to this entire region as India. So you have this imposition now of what some people at the time called the steel frame of British colonial control, which would keep India together, which would govern India, and this is the big thing about this new imposition. The Indian civil service, those who ran this colony, would argue in essence that they were proceeding from an in-depth knowledge of South Asia. The idea will be that colonial control is informed by colonial knowledge. Let me give you a few examples of sort of physical changes that result, and then we'll start talking about some of these sort of more mental or perhaps even sort of psychological changes that result. The new colonial government in South Asia spends a lot of time and money on construction, quite simply. That is, not only will they continue to foster the building of railways to move materials, soldiers, etc., they will continue to build up telegraph lines. They will go on a huge building craze or building boom regarding canals. That is, places like the Punjab will see their already prosperous agricultural status enhanced. In part, this is due to this idea that the Indian state ought to be more productive. It's also due to the fact that the Punjabis, remember, had supported the East India Company during the rebellion of 1857. And the Punjabis are rewarded now for their loyalty or their alliance. You have the construction of new blocks of administrative buildings, new railway stations, dams to go along with these irrigation and canal projects. One of the things that very much concerns this sort of new set of rulers in India is making themselves legitimate. That is, not just through the demonstration of power, which they have, that is, through the British military, through control of this Indian army they now have, through the massive buildup of what will become the Indian Police Service, but also through, again, sort of very public demonstrations of power. The people who run what we refer to as the Raj are very interested in showing how legitimate their rule is in South Asia. This is Queen Victoria being pronounced, this is published upon her sort of acceptance of the title of Empress of India, which doesn't actually come until 1875. But is part of the larger plan of, in some sense, sort of normalizing control of South Asia under Britain. That is, the idea is taken up that basically India, South Asia has always had empires, therefore it needs an emperor or an empress. Therefore, we've got to name Victoria the Empress. But it's more than that. In the cities in particular, the major urban centers of what becomes British India, in the late 19th century, there is a huge boom in building, as I said, sort of public buildings, administrative buildings, railway terminals in particular. This is one. This is, or was, the Bombay Municipal Building. It still houses lots of offices for the current government of the city of Mumbai. It's done up in a rather sort of intricate and detailed architecture, which historians have struggled to describe since the minute they saw it. What they call it mostly, and what the people who ran India called it, was Indo-Saracenic, which was a combination, sorry, that should be clear, Indo-Saracenic, Indian, Saracenic being another word for Islamic or Muslim. Yeah.
Is there also, it looks like there's influence of a Gothic revival?
Oh yes, oh yeah. It's a combination of three things. The idea of sort of Indian architecture, Mughal architecture, and what we might call sort of the neo-Gothic or Gothic revival of the middle of the 19th century. That is, the Gothic revival that brings you such things as the British Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, things like Big Ben. What you have is this effort to sort of amalgamate all sorts of different architectural styles. And they'll do it here in Mumbai. They'll do it in what they will call Madras at the train station here, or one of the train stations here. The motorcycles are much later. So it's development in South Asia. As I mentioned, railways here. You can see the massive number of railways already constructed by 1909. And things like this, the triumphant gateway to India, built in 1911 for a royal visit to Mumbai. And to give you one other building here, this is another municipal building in Mumbai, again. These are designed not only to sort of overwhelm people, but the people who designed them figured they could pack a lot of messages in. In particular, they wanted to stress one thing, that British rule in South Asia was not something absolutely new or absolutely novel, but rather that British imperial control in South Asia was simply the successor to, or the British Empire in South Asia was a successor to previous South Asian empires, be they the Mughals or going all the way back to Ashoka. That is, that you would use this architectural style, which attempted to include just about everything from current fads in Britain to what they saw as sort of Mughal and Indian designs, as a way of demonstrating the sort of natural progression of imperial control in South Asia. It is an effort to basically argue that Britain is not an alien presence, but rather that Britain is simply one in a longer series of imperial actors or imperial regimes in this part of the world. That's at least the effort. But what you're seeing is this effort to sort of introduce almost a sort of a natural idea, or almost a normalized idea of colonial control. That they look, again, they look sort of like a successor, not an alien intruder. One thing that I should stress is they tended to use these type of designs in two types of buildings. One is these sort of public or municipal buildings, administrative centers. And I think there we can see the idea, again, of sort of successor to previous regimes. The other place they really liked to use this type of architecture was railway stations. In Mumbai and Chennai and elsewhere, because part of the way in which British colonialism was justified was not simply through power, but through, as I said, knowledge. The idea that Britain was entitled to rule not only because of the power it could bring to bear in South Asia, but because of the knowledge that it could bring to South Asia. That Britain was a technologically superior place, and that its rule in Asia was based in a sort of a desire to spread benevolently the latest in technology, to bring quote-unquote progress or modernity to South Asia. Hence, you have this sort of building at railway stations. Associate railway stations with this particular empire to promote two things. The idea that Britain has this technology and therefore is a sort of superior civilization, but also to argue that Britain is bringing this technology to South Asia. So the idea is, again, you're trying to construct various ways of legitimizing your own rule in this colony, using architecture, using physical construction as at least one way to do that. Any questions about this? Yeah.
Did all this building and canals and stuff have any kind of adverse environmental effects with India?
Not necessarily. I mean, the canal building actually made agriculture more productive in some places. It did divert water at times further downstream. That is, that places that were seen as less loyal or having been less loyal in the 1850s didn't get the same level of improvements. That is, I mean, the Punjab is treated by many British colonial officials as sort of this prized possession. Because it's got people who are loyal. As we'll talk about, people in the Punjab are going to be recruited very heavily into this new Indian army under the control of the British colonial state. People will sort of clamor to go and be civil servants or colonial administrators in the Punjab because it's seen as this place where you can do a lot of things. So there's a diversion of resources there, but by and large, there's not a lot of environmental impact. The greater environmental impact is going to come in a couple of ways. First of all, much denser urbanization. That is because of the sort of location of administrative centers in cities, because of the rising population that will be attracted to these cities for trade, for various other sort of opportunities. The railways as well will help to centralize population by, in essence, saying that by locating the railways within population centers, will actually attract more people. The railways often also will increase demands for indigenous coal production in the northeastern part of India and what's now Bangladesh. One of the things that will not happen for a long time, not until the turn of the 20th century, is that the British colonial state will not allow Indians to begin creating their own industrial or sort of, they won't allow Indians to start building factories with, steam-driven machinery, making textiles or anything like that, because they want to keep India as a market for British-made goods. So you have a sort of a later onset of industrialization in that way. But overall, the environmental impact of things like canals is very limited. It's more the railways and also the sort of drive towards urbanization. I think are the big keys. You have, as I mentioned, this desire to sort of make British colonial government seem natural, seem part of the sort of historical progression within South Asia. As opposition to British colonialism grows, especially after the First World War, you actually can see a marked change in how the British colonial state constructs its buildings. That is, the buildings they construct at the end of the First World War through the 20s and 30s are very different. They abandon the idea of sort of being inclusive in architecture, bringing in Mughal and bringing in indigenous styles, but instead they go for a much more sort of traditional Roman triumphal architecture. This is the War Memorial in New Delhi to soldiers who fought and died in the First World War, both British and Indian, fighting for the British Empire. It's part of this massive construction that goes along with the relocation of the capital from Calcutta to New Delhi after the First World War. That is, the British colonial capital remained Calcutta up until the First World War. Afterwards, it moves to New Delhi, which is this entirely new sort of administrative center set down outside of the outskirts of the old city of Delhi, that is, again, designed to represent sort of the power of the colonial state, but presents a different picture. It uses a much more sort of triumphalist or sort of authoritarian type of architecture. It's not about necessarily saying that Britain is legitimized by being in Asia because other empires have been here before, but rather it just simply says, we're here, deal with it. They construct this long avenue, don't worry about the name, but it's called Rajpath, where they stage military parades, where parades are still staged on certain days in India to this day. At the other end of it, they build this massive, you can sort of see the dome here. They don't allow you, this was about 12 years ago, where they only allow you to stop very briefly to take a picture. I'm taking this basically and beginning to run at the same point. There are other pictures of it, but I wanted to use this one to give you an idea of this sort of this massive dome, this massive sort of, again, Roman-style architecture. They build new administrative buildings that, again, they'll have a couple of cupolas on top, but they have a much more in terms of columns. They have, you see these sort of wide open spaces. This is where the Indian Parliament meets to this day. This is where the Indian president lives right now. It's where, under British colonial control, the Viceroy lived. And there's a couple of interesting things about the construction of New Delhi itself. The first is that the construction of it greatly impressed one certain group of people, and that is the Nazis. That is, the capital, this new colonial capital in New Delhi, was studied quite intensively by Albert Speer and others of the sort of other Nazi architects. And it was one of the models they looked to for how they would construct a post-war Berlin. That would be the capital of the new German Reich. That is, they loved the idea of these major sort of domed buildings. They loved the idea of triumphal arches. Again, going back to this sort of traditional Roman imperial architecture. But they really thought that this was authoritarian architecture that they could support. It never actually happened, but Speer did draw up plans during the war as to what this new capital would look like, and he incorporated a lot of elements, that sort of geometric designs, sort of avenues radiating out from a central place, the use of arches and the use of these massive sort of domed buildings with columns and all these other sort of Greco-Roman influences. The other interesting thing is that if you go through this here, you walk down here, there is this sort of pedestal where until 1947, a statue of the British monarch stood. That is, the last one there was George VI. Queen Elizabeth was his daughter, or is his daughter, and succeeded him in 1952. After Indian independence in 1947, obviously they took down the statue of George VI. In fact, there is a place outside Delhi, this vacant lot where you can go, and it's where they've relocated all of these statues from the colonial era. Queen Victoria, governors of provinces, military figures, and others. They haven't just destroyed them, they've simply put them in this vacant lot, sort of somewhat akin to everyone pulling down the statues of of Lenin in 1989, 1990. Except they weren't sort of chopped up, they were simply sort of deposited for people to come visit. Since then, it has remained empty because no one can figure out who they want to put there. There's one obvious contender, Gandhi. The problem is, this is still where they hold all the military parades. This is this massive, dare I say it, quasi-authoritarian, any architecture that impresses a fascist is something I think you have to think about twice. The idea is that there's really only one person who can go there, Gandhi, but you can't put Gandhi in there because it just looks all wrong. You can't have tanks rolling by Gandhi every Republic Day and every India Day, every Independence Day celebration. So it's remained blank to this day because, and in some ways it represents this real tension because it's a recognition in some ways that the India that exists now, the Republic of India that exists now, is not perhaps the India Gandhi wanted. Gandhi didn't want the British there, but he also didn't think that you should simply take over from the Brits. Many others in the 1940s will disagree with Gandhi, but I think there is a recognition, not only that it sort of looks bad, but rather people whose job it is basically, Gandhi's family and others, to protect the Gandhian legacy. They are really concerned about, having Gandhi, in some senses, used to legitimize a sort of state that he would not have approved. Yeah.
What's that called?
This whole area is called Rajpath, R-A-J-P-A-T-H. This is simply called the India Arch. And you can see again, but the big thing here is that as colonial government becomes less secure, as the challenges mounted by people like Gandhi to the colonial state become stronger and stronger, the colonial state begins to resort more to sort of brute force. Not only the actual use of physical force, but in the way in which the colonial state displays itself. They go from trying to say we are sort of including the past, we are legitimizing ourselves that way, to simply now saying we are legitimizing ourselves through a demonstration of power. Yeah.
Are the British still in the control of the government there?
Oh, no, not since 1947. No, that's why the statute came down in 1947, when you have the split of what had been British India into the Republic of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So you have, as I said, you have this. I wanted to sort of show this way in which architecture again is sort of working. Architecture on a sort of non-dramatic or a much less dramatic scale is also important, because there's something that we have to now talk about. When we talk about sort of the not just the physical, but sort of the mental construction of the colonial state in India. That is, the colonial state in British India is based ultimately on one idea. An idea that had been espoused by people before 1858, but really gets hammered home after 1858. This notion of difference. The difference is what justifies British rule, and the difference is also the hallmark of South Asian society. That is, difference is, everything revolves around difference. Let me explain it very briefly by saying this. That there will be different types of difference emphasized by the British colonial system. The first, obviously, would be the difference between white Europeans and native South Asians. That there is a difference between Christianity and Hinduism and Islam. That there is a difference which can be, in some senses, translated shorthand through skin color. But that India is, or South Asia, is a much less advanced, a much less cultured, a much less civilized place. This is built on ideas of sort of comparative civilizations. It, over the course of the 19th century, is reinforced by growing ideas of what's called I use quotes around that, of race. But the notion is that South Asian difference is South Asian inferiority. Cultural inferiority, physical inferiority. That is, again, this difference is very much in the aid of justifying colonial rule. The argument will be made that South Asians live in such inhospitable climates, with such heat in particular, that it has in some ways affected their moral development. The argument will be that too much time in India saps you of your character and your virtue. That India is not only a place where you can catch something like malaria, but actually India is a place that can lead to both your physical and moral degeneration. That is, that you have this this notion that the more time you spend in India, the more like an Indian you will become, and that's not a good thing. But one of the arguments becomes that ancient India, the India of the Vedas and things like that this was a proud civilization, but people came in and they lived far too long in this climate, with the result that they degenerated. That's how you get practices like sati. That's how you get what they call sort of the irrationalism of Hinduism. The British will be very concerned about this. One of the things they will do is they will attempt to mark out sort of a physical separation from what they consider the climate of India. They will live apart very much from indigenous people in cities or in towns. They will establish sort of demarcations, walls in particular. The British will also very much try to will very much sort of create this idea that if you live in India, you can only live for a certain number of months in the heat. That is, you live sort of 6 months in the hot areas, New Delhi, cities like Lucknow, cities like Chennai or Mumbai. But then for the other 5 or 6 months of the year, you need to go up into the hills. You need to go up where it's cooler. But if you can go up where it's cooler, you can keep yourself from degenerating mentally and physically. They establish in hills or sort of small mountain ranges to the north of Delhi, in places like Kashmir, in places like central India, outside of Chennai or near Chennai, they establish what's called hill stations. I'll bring some pictures of that next time. We'll look at that before we talk about Orwell. But basically, where they recreate little British villages. If you go today, the most famous north of Delhi is called Shimla. Sometimes it's spelled without the H, but it's pronounced Shimla. Where if you wander around, it's still a hugely popular vacation destination, but it's this little sort of town up, it's at about, it doesn't sound like much to us, but it's up around sort of, 9 or 10,000 feet. And there's a small railway that gets you up there, and it's, there are sort of mock Tudor cottages and little English country churches and rose bushes and cricket clubs and all this stuff. And the idea was you sort of went up there and you acted English for a while. And you wore tweed. And you could use woolen blankets at night when the temperature dropped. And that this, in some ways, restored your sense of Englishness or Britishness. To us it sounds a little sort of crazy, but it is, again, by insisting on this difference, the colonial state sort of almost mandates that you have to live this way. You can't say it's the climate that's caused you to degenerate and then keep living in that climate full time. Otherwise, people may start to point out that you're degenerating as well.
Is there like a sexual component to this, or kind of like it's like in Doctor Strangelove, there's the line that the Jack T. Ripper is like the communist conspiracies after our precious bodily fluids. That if you look back in the 19th century, there was indeed a lot of that kind of rhetoric about in terms of
oh yeah,
sperm masturbation, And I remember learning that among the influences of the British Raj, one of them was to kind of rein in the elements of sexual expression within Indian art and so forth.
well, they definitely regarded, in particular Hinduism, as an overly erotic, or almost sort of, they basically had this idea that again, this brings up sort of the glaring contradictions at the heart of colonial rhetoric. But the argument went that this sort of environment caused people to degenerate morally, and that particularly Indian men degenerated morally. But the argument sort of became sort of strange because on the one hand, you had many who argued, well, Indian men degenerate morally, that's why they're weak. That's why they're physically and morally weak. That's why they can't fight. One of the things that happens after the Indian Rebellion is that the place that's identified as the sort of birthplace of it, the province of Bengal, Bengalis are basically told, get out of the army. And this new explanation is given, Bengalis aren't that strong, Bengalis are weak. Despite the fact that they've been sort of the backbone of the East India Company Army for 100 years. Bengalis aren't strong, Bengalis are physically weak, we need Punjabis. They said Punjabis live in the north. Punjabis live in sort of, more temperate climates. Therefore, Punjabis are sort of stronger. Hang on one second. Let me just mention one other thing here. But at the same time as they argued that people were sort of weak and indolent and overly sort of sensual, they were interested in sort of, the physical and emotional sentiment, not in, the hard work of governance. At the same time, they also argued that Indian men were these sort of predators on women. I mean, one of the traditional sort of tropes or the traditional sort of slogans that would be trotted out whenever someone suggested giving Indians more political power or something was that they'll use it to attack white women. That is, the big colonial trope goes, on the one hand, Indian men in particular are weak and powerless. On the other hand, Indian men are predators who will overpower and attack and assault white women, and they won't even be able to control themselves. So you have this, there is this very much this emphasis on the notion that sort of Indians are victims of their own, in some senses, unbridled physical desires. They want, they look at Indian erotic art. They look at temple statues. They look at this place in north central India called Khajuraho, where all of the temples are basically covered with figures engaged in various sexual acts, demonstrating parts of the Kama Sutra, demonstrating simply sort of an erotic element within this sort of Hindu expression of devotion. But the British look at that and they say this absolutely, this represents what Indians are absolutely all about. The British can't stop going and looking at it, but they are also saying that this sort of stuff needs to come to an end. What is very funny is that in India itself, places like Shimla became known as places of enormous sort of sexual indiscretion. It said you could always tell when the breakfast gong was about to ring at a hotel in Shimla, because you'd hear the slamming of doors as all the guests went back to their original rooms. Because it tended to be actually people who went up there. Sometimes it was wives and children of people in the army, officers in the army who would be only there occasionally. But it became this sort of, how should I put it? Places like Shimla became sort of shorthand for Brits behaving badly, men and women behaving badly, and sort of what happened in the hill station stayed in the hill stations, and you never talked about it again. Yeah.
Is this kind of weather theory? Did the Brits put this on all of the globe, like their Caribbean possessions and stuff?
Yes. To various degrees. They put it most systematically, though, in India, because I think it's because control of India was so important. And they had to justify control of this place so explicitly. But yes, this idea, these sort of climatic theories are trotted out, and the old argument had been, well, you sort of, climate produces race. That is that, Africans are darker in skin color because of greater exposure to the sun, because of living on the equator or living in tropical or subtropical areas. That gets sort of abandoned in the case of South Asia for more this idea that the climate has sapped people's character. One of the things that they have to do, and one of the things that the British have to do, is they have to find a way to sort of justify their insistence that South Asians are inferior, but also at the same time deal with the reality of what South Asian culture had been like before the British arrival. That is, how do you deal with everything from Ashoka to the Mughals without granting South Asians some sort of political and cultural and social power? But the answer they come up with is everything in South Asia used to be better, but you've all been here now for too many generations, and it's all just started to go to hell. And they made the argument largely about Hindus. That is that after the Indian Rebellion, one in which there was a significant Muslim participation, but the blame is largely placed on Bengali Hindus. And South Asian Muslims are in British eyes, not quite as culpable. But you have, again, this insistence on difference between Britain and South Asia. Difference in climate. The climate, in some ways, is this deterministic factor. It explains everything. But there's something else, too, and this is important to remember. The British justified their rule not only on difference between European civilization and South Asian life, but they also justified their rule on the fact that there existed so many differences within India itself. That is, differences used as sort of this overall justification, European versus South Asian. But the existence of what the British said are so many hard and fast splits or divisions within South Asia also justify British colonial control. They basically argued that a region like South Asia had so many internal divisions that this idea that there could ever be a unified Indian state or a self-governing India was out of the question. What they argued was, in essence, that there were sort of, as I said, there were religious splits, there were linguistic splits. In particular, the British colonial system argued that caste was this source of permanent division in South Asia, and that caste and the existence of caste meant that people couldn't govern themselves because they would be controlled by sort of these sort of sectional or divides, or these sort of caste-based divisions. So this becomes another argument. The argument becomes that India is a place that has or contains enormous differences and irreconcilable differences. And one of the things that has become very much sort of a point of, not contention, because most people sort of seem to agree with this, but for historians of South Asia, they look at the 19th century and what they say is that things like caste, things like religious identity, were not perhaps as inflexible, were not perhaps as rigid as the British made them out to be. But the British colonial control actually contributed very significantly to making them much more rigid. That is, that British colonial control imposed this idea of unchanging difference upon South Asia. That is, that the British argument for control was, for example, Hindus and Muslims have never gotten along, which wasn't the case. If you look at the Mughals, you look at the era of the Delhi Sultanate, had every Hindu and every Muslim in India gotten along perfectly at all times? No. But then lots of Hindus hadn't gotten along. You even had Buddhists who didn't get along. You had splits and people walked to different monasteries, things like that. You have religious difference argued by the British. You also have, as I said, caste. One of the things the British argue is that India is a place governed by the ancient idea of caste. That marks it off as separate from Britain. Because as we know, in England, there's no class system. There's no rigidity of where you're born. Anyways, so you have this sort of idea of difference between Britain and South Asia. And then the idea is that there's this different sort of foundational difference within South Asia. These caste differences will never be sort of crossed or never be eliminated. Yeah.
So they had these ideas about how they could control South Asia by bringing all these differences and talking about all this stuff. But how did they, that's propaganda, right? How did they actually get that message?
Well, it is propaganda in some ways, but yes, you're right. How do they physically do it? Well, in a couple of ways. The first thing they do, and this is again, they come in talking about caste and saying how rigid caste is. One of the things that the British in the 19th century loved to do is they loved to do surveys. They liked to map places. They liked to statistics. They did it all over the world, wherever they were. And one of the things that happens in South Asia in the 1870s and the 1880s is the British colonial government institutes a census process. Once every 10 years, they're going to do a census determining, who's out there. But this census contributes a great deal to the formalization of caste. Because caste, remember, caste was this sort of overarching idea, but within each of those supposed, 4 caste groups, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of what were called jati. Castes that at times could be simply localized. Castes that could be sort of based on relationships. That is, this family has always served this family, something like that. It was occupational. It was also relational. This family has always been a tenant of this family, etc. The British come through and they say, we've got to basically make this argument or we've got to basically figure out who we have here in South Asia. And so what they say to people is not sort of, what caste are you? And then allow for the explosion of this sort of jati and numbers of, sort of intricate explanations of caste. Because this is a bureaucracy, and a bureaucracy can only deal with a limited amount of complexity. So what they would do in the census is they wouldn't say, what caste group are you? They would say, which of the following are you? And so they limited the choices. And one of the things that happens is that in late 19th century South Asia, there's a sort of great deal of what might be called social self-promotion. People will say, oh, I'm in this caste. Their neighbors may disagree vehemently, but they get counted as that. And what happens is that caste identity starts to harden. The notion that caste is something that can be categorized more easily sets in. And in particular, the idea of what's interesting is that there had always been a sort of fluidity, especially within caste groups, within these larger groups like Kshatriya or Vaishya. What happens now, people weren't asked, are you a Kshatriya or are you a Vaishya? They simply were asked, what type of Kshatriya are you? Are you a Kutriya, Kurki, something like that? And people would choose. And that sort of cemented their caste identity a bit more. So you have, again, a way in which these sort of differences are made real. With the result that by the time you get to the early 20th century, you have in some ways the elimination of some of these jati. Because people have tended to sort of place themselves in larger caste groupings. The big thing is this, is that how should I put it? These censuses, these insistences on caste as being deterministic of everything within South Asian life, it tends to sort of limit people's worldviews as well. That is, they say, I'm a member of this group now. Whereas previously, there had been, as I said, sort of, a willingness of people, you could take a different job. It wasn't so stark, perhaps, as the British made it out to be. But then the British put in place a system that sort of reinforced what they believed. Another element goes in the way in which they divide India into quote-unquote races. They'll argue that within South Asia you have sort of more evolved and lesser evolved, but in particular, they'll argue that you have certain races who are more masculine, certain groups that are more militaristic. One of the things that is used is this idea of what becomes known as martial races. Basically, that certain groups of South Asians are more inclined to be good soldiers. This tends to arise out of the fact that after 1858, not only does the colonial system want to reward Punjabis by giving them sort of environmental innovations in irrigation and canals and things like that, but also that they're going to build up a new army in India that's going to draw from places that had that draw from areas where loyalty had remained during the events of 1857-58. That's especially true of the Punjab. So you have this idea that Punjabis, in particular Punjabi Sikhs, are physically stronger, are more masculine, more manly. This will ultimately extend to some others. That is, people who live in the far north of what's now India, people who live in the border with Nepal. You have, again, the recruitment of these so-called martial races into the British Indian Army. Yeah.
Are all those attributes like kind of made up for the British actually
Well, there are. What happens is that basically, at least initially, they seem to be sort of made up. The argument is that basically Punjabis had remained loyal, therefore Punjabis had desirable characteristics. But what happens is what begins to occur in the Punjab in particular, especially among Punjabi Sikhs, is this becomes sort of assimilated into their own identity. That Punjabis have this sort of special martial quality to them. I mean, one of the things that happens is the British will recruit thousands of Punjabis and people from Nepal, people from what's now the area between Pakistan and Afghanistan into the army, and it gives these people sort of a benefit or a position within the colonial state that they're reluctant to lose. So it becomes actually sort of beneficial for Sikhs to continue to stress this idea. And I mean, I think it's I mean, up until the 1960s, well, Punjabi Sikhs were never the absolute majority of soldiers in the Indian Army. They were still disproportionately represented. Only in the 1960s, 1970s, in the new independent India, do you start to see this insistence, basically, against a Punjabi-dominated military. And it's not just Sikhs. I mean, one of the things that will emerge is that the creation of Pakistan, which includes a part of this region called the Punjab, there you have Punjabi Muslims who themselves have been recruited into the army, and they will form sort of the backbone of a lot of the sort of first generation of the military in an independent Pakistan. It's going to be very sort of regional, that Punjabis are going to dominate certain things. And again, it only begins to change in India itself in the 1960s and 1970s. But you have sort of the granting of special privileges. That's the way in which the colonial state will work. It will grant special privileges to certain groups in the hope that these groups will, in some senses, sort of internalize that position. It is, for most of the late 19th and early 20th century, the British are fairly successful at that. They do recruit a lot of Punjabis into the army. They do basically banish Bengalis, whether Hindu or Muslim Bengalis, from the ranks of the army. Bengalis get assigned to sort of the lowest rank now of this sort of hierarchy of South Asian civilizations that the British construct. Bengalis are seen as sort of physically weak and morally weak as well. So the idea is you've got to sort of construct difference. Not only the difference between, or sort of emphasize difference, the difference between Europeans and South Asians, and then the differences within South Asia. And use both to argue for British control. Britain is superior, and Britain is also here, in essence, to keep the rest of South Asia from falling on each other. What it means is that you can build up an argument for what you might call colonial prestige or imperial rule based on this idea of strength, but also this idea of sort of benevolence. That the British rule in India, because they are so powerful, but they are using that power to prevent what would otherwise be enormous internal carnage in South Asia. Is everyone with me so far? Okay. One of the and this is something that we'll need to keep in mind with Orwell is the notion of prestige. That is, what is British rule in India supposed to do? What is it supposed to represent? What does that mean, not simply for the people being ruled, but even for the rulers themselves? How do they see themselves? How do they define their own place in South Asia? There are just a couple of other sort of moments or ideas that I want to present really quickly, which is that it's not simply a one-way imposition. That is, there will be within South Asia, groups who respond to the changing colonial regime. Lots of South Asians will seek to work with the colonial state, either within it, in an administrative capacity, in a military capacity. They will seek jobs on things like the railways. They will attempt to use the colonial state to their own advantage. And after 1857, well, there will be some soul searching on the part of some of the people who participated or supported 1857. There will be many more who will argue, in essence, that British colonial control is the reality. And you can either retreat completely from reality or you can engage with it. One of the things that's going to happen is that Indian nationalism in the late 19th century is going to arise less from those people who are rejecting or trying to reject all British colonial control or reject any participation in it, but rather it's going to emerge from those who are participating in it. Because participation in it will, in fact, reinforce the ways in which Britain ultimately is subjugating people, the way in which Britain is ultimately reducing people or insisting on South Asians' own inferior status. That is, that people will participate in it, but in doing so, will in some ways become more politicized than those who remain outside. We're going to talk more after we get through, after we get through the exam, about how various groups in India will respond to the colonial state. But I want to just give you that sort of broad sense right now, that there will be many people who will not reject outright the colonial state, but will seek to work within it. But oftentimes the process of working within it politicizes them more, radicalizes them more, and also gives them avenues with which in which they can pursue political liberalization, economic reform, than those who have remained outside. So we're going to see, because that's going to be a real tension, and something that's very much reflected in the history of this region to this day, how people study the history, about what you do with people and their involvement in the colonial state and the relationship of that to their demands. Ultimately, the colonial state must go. All right. I said we'd end a few minutes early, so we can pass these out. This is not studying for it. We're taping it a week from today. We're talking about George Orwell on Thursday. This is the review sheet. This is giving you a sense of what will be on the exam. It's fairly self-explanatory, I think, but there will be 20 multiple-choice questions. The people, places, ideas, etc. laid out here are what will inform those questions. It doesn't mean I'm simply going to say, Akbar was A Mughal emperor, B, I don't know, the Prince of Egypt, things like that. They're going to be a little more subtle than that. But 20 questions. Some may ask you for sort of chronology. They'll say these 4 events in a row, which is the correct from earliest to latest. There may be some matching in columns of A to B, etc., or A to 1 and B to 2, stuff like that. Then there's 2 short essays. I've given you 4 essays here. Out of these questions, I'm going to take 3 and put them on the exam. Of those 3, you write on 2. So you can prepare all 4, you can prepare 3. I would urge you to prepare 3 or 4 of these. You can't come in with outlines, but you have a lot of time to prepare. And one good way to think about preparing is to think about how you will use these keywords and IDs and terms in the actual essays themselves. Yes?
Did you say you can or you
Can't what?
can't come in without?
No outlines. Yeah. You are free to draw them up in your studying. You're free to write practice essays. You are free to study together if you want. You're free to study in complete solitude, obviously, if you want. Just a couple of things. People always will say to me, how long should these essays be? The answer I always say is that these essays should be long enough. That is, you can write very little in a very long time. You can pack a lot into a fairly short time. Don't feel that there's a minimum or maximum length. Do try to do several things. In the first place, make an argument. All of these questions ask you to either make an argument or lay out 3 examples of something. When making an argument, be as specific as you can. Use as many details as you can. The more general you are, the less effective your argument. There is a difference, which I always want to stress to people, between assertion and argument. Assertion is what we largely have in this culture, in this country today. I say this, you say that. We should now shout at each other on cable news. Argument is, this is why this happened. Here are 3 specific pieces of evidence that back this up. Arguments are persuasive. Assertions are annoying. So basically, to state something without any sort of evidence is an assertion. To state it with evidence is to make an argument. Use specifics in the argument. Structure the arguments. Think about as you look at these potential essay questions, what's the first thing I'm going to say? Is my instantaneous response yes? Is my response, here are these 3 examples. Here are these 2 ways. Do not waste your time writing elaborate introductory paragraphs that begin things like, since history began, or, history is full of events, and things like that. Just get out of that, get right to what you're doing. You are free to come in and recreate on the outlines you had made before class on the paper. You don't need to bring green books, blue books, whatever color books. I will provide you with Scantron sheets for the multiple choice. You will provide pieces of paper to write on. I will then eventually staple them all together. The state of Colorado will spot you each one staple. Don't ask for more. But you'll bankrupt us. Again, make an argument. Be specific. Avoid generalizations. No, we can talk about this more. If you have specific questions about them things, we can address them on Thursday when we talk about Orwell, or before or after we talk about Orwell. I'm not going to go through everything here. My office hours, I'll be in tomorrow from 10 to 12:30. I'll be in next Monday from 10 to 12:30. I'll be around a little bit on Thursday in between the 2 classes I teach, but otherwise. I can't read drafts, but I'm happy if you want to come in and talk to me about ideas for these essays. I'm going to put, I promise, by Friday morning, by Thursday morning, all of the lectures that I've taped and every PowerPoint presentation will be on the Blackboard site for you to use. Yes?
What's your office number?
It's Central 211, and then I'm Office P, I think. Just go in and ask where I am. It's this rabbit warren of offices. Other questions? Also, relax about it. I did not get into this profession to try to fool as many people as possible. Okay, I would have been a politician if I wanted to do that. I did not get in this to pull tricks on people. There is nothing on the exam that will not be that is not reflected on this review sheet. There is nothing that is designed to trick you absolutely. I suppose I do have a reputation as sort of being someone who grades essays in particular very closely. So I would urge you to think very much as you're reading or writing out an outline or thinking about how you're going to structure something. Think to yourself, is this an argument and am I being specific enough? All right, I will see you all on Thursday, in which we will talk about George Orwell and elephants in Burma. Okay, thank you all.
So that paper's due on next Thursday and the test on the 9th?
The test is the 8th. Test is the 8th. The paper's due 2 days from now. We're discussing, yeah. Okay.
Where